Okay, good afternoon. Thanks, Deborah, for the opportunity to speak to you. I've been giving this talk a lot, although I will be giving it a lot by the time the summer's here, as a result of the increased number of presentations that we're doing with what Deborah's organizing as the American Vineyard Foundation Regional Road Shows. So if anybody were in Paso the other day, sorry, you're going to get the same talk. And if you're going to Lodi in a week or so, you might see the same thing again. But I want to stop right here and just say the acknowledgement slide that I forgot to put in, which I usually do for every talk, we all try to do for every talk, is to acknowledge the funding from the American Vineyard Foundation, the Viticulture Consortium, which is USDA funds, so federal funds, and what we call the CCG, the California Competitive Grant Program in Viticulture and Enology, which are state funds. So we have private funds, federal funds, and state funds coming together, and some years we get different mixes, so I just acknowledge all of them all the time. I want to thank Deborah Galino and her staff, Sue Sim, Susan Nelson-Kluk, Adib Rohani, and others who have been instrumental in getting some portions of this experiment up and running. I want to thank them for that. And of course, Mike Anderson and Jason Benz, the technical staff that help take all of the data and the presentations, the statistics, et cetera. So I want to thank everyone who's been involved. I'm going to make this talk, it's going to be a little bit shorter than 30 minutes, so it would get us a little bit back on track. Deborah already went over this, so I won't go back over it. We're obviously interested in documenting a lot of things about clones. These are some of the things we're interested in. Obviously, this is the hardest one, the bottom one here, the wine quality attributes. And by the way, I don't think this pointer shows up that well, so I'll try to indicate where I'm pointing. But we obviously are interested in lots of things. Cluster architecture is one that we don't pay that much attention to, really. Most places that have rot potential, like Europe, do pay a lot of attention to that. And there's a great graph in the First Cool Climate book that shows differences in Pinot Noir rot as a result of cluster architecture. And I'd be happy to point you to that if you have never seen that. Of course, this is the kind of thing that we see. This is a Cabernet talk, but this happened to be just a Chardonnay photo that I had in the file. On your left is the super clone, if you will, Chardonnay 4. But the interesting thing about this is if you were to compare not just 4 against 16, but if you look at the berry uniformity in this cluster on the left, compared to, you can see a couple of examples, these two right here at the top.
Dr. Waterhouse has given us a pointer that really...
Thank you. Thanks, Andy. I think I lost the last one you gave me, so you better be careful with this one, I guess. But is that better? Anyway, so again, berry size differences, uniformity size differences are one of the things that we see. So in this particular trial, I'm going to make another mention of this, but just to make a mention now, that whenever you set up a clonal trial, everybody's interested in the stuff that comes after you set the trial up, unfortunately. So it seems like whenever we get to a point of actually having old enough vines to take data and about 3 or 4 years worth of data, everybody's interested in the things that came in down the road after that. But I'll give you a graph in a second about which 12 clones we did, but just to let you know that we, of course, do them in replicated fashion. We're about, so 6 feet by 8. Rootstock is 10114, VSP bilateral cordon. We pruned to about 12 shoots per meter, and we took the average of 3 years, which is 2005 through 2007. Deborah went over this list, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I will make a couple of contrasts in the data between this line right here, 14 and up, because we have some experience previously with these selections in other trials in other places. And essentially, to my knowledge, the 24 through 31, this is the first data. Deborah presented the contrast of the virus-infected versus virus-free materials. We'll just spend our time on the virus-free ones, and then some data on 169 from France. But again, I'm going to make some comparisons of what we have typically seen with these 14 and under clones versus the other one. So we've had in trial before with Mark Cleaver many years ago at Oakville 2, 6, and 8, and we have had at a trial in Lodi 2, 4, 6, 8, and 14, amongst others. We've actually had 5 in there as well. But the pattern we see here is typical of what we've seen before. The highest yielding of this 14 and under is the 14 at about 3.4. So these Chilean selections tend to be more high yielding. We've tended to see that time and time again. Cabernet 8 is the sort of, we call that our high yielding one, but that's the high yielding of the more widely used selections. That comes in at about 2.9, and then 2 and 4 tend to group together a little bit. About 10% under Cabernet 8, which again we call that our standard. The more widely planted selections is that Concanon 7 and 8, and that's again what we see. Sometimes it's a little bit more than 10%, but this is not atypical of what we've seen before. And then bringing up the rear for these first 5 selections is Clone 6. That's the Jackson selection. Even when you actually look at the Pinot Noirs that also come from that Jackson ranch, they're also fairly low yielding. So I don't know if that's characteristic of that very, very old planting from the 1880s. But at any rate, that's what we see. So about 60% of the yield of Cabernet 8 is where 6 usually comes in. Typically, we have not seen so much difference in the cluster number. Typically, it's been more cluster weight, but we do see a little bit of difference in cluster number. But again, as Glenn mentioned, the other people may have mentioned, when we prune these to a set number of shoots per meter, that pretty much sets the cluster number. And what we can see here is that much of that difference now is due to cluster weight in grams, and berries per cluster is the primary driver of that, although in this case, berry weight is involved, and I'll show you some of those data very quickly in just a second. So now from 24 on down, a couple of things you can see is that we tend to have some that are the higher yielding ones. So FPS 27 looking more like 14. We have 24, 26 in that group of, say, middle yielding, so slightly around the 2.4, a little bit under Cabernet 8. And that's about all we can say about them right now. We didn't take a whole lot more data that would characterize them in any way. But I'll go back to what Deborah said, which is the more interesting ones here, these heritage selections, is that FPS 29 and 30 acting maybe more like 8, at about 3 kilos or slightly thereabouts. But it's this FPS 31, which is very interesting. In fact, slightly, not significantly, even a little bit lower than FPS 6. And again, here too, also the cluster number is very interesting. So it raises a question which our French colleague maybe has given some encouragement for the idea that maybe one day we'll try to be able to tell whether these are truly different or not, or maybe they're reselections of the same thing going forward. So we'll see. So again, about 1 gram berries, 0.9 grams to 1 gram berries, and that there's a lot of good correlation usually between berries per cluster and cluster weight for Cabernet. So here again, there's a list of the clones. There's the berry weight, Brix, PHTA. Not a lot of interesting stuff going on. The pH is typical for our Oakville plot, even though the Brix levels are pretty high. The pH is still very, very fine, in about 6.5 to 7 grams of acid. And again, a lot of uniformity in the berry size here. We do see FPS 6, as I mentioned, a little bit lower, but by and large 0.9 to 1. So most of the interest is in the berries per cluster, and that's leading to cluster weight, which is leading to the yield difference. Well, it's a bit of a dilemma that we have in our current understanding. I'm going to separate this talk on from where we're just talking about Cabernet clones to some issues in general. For this group, I think it's important to know that obviously you would prefer to have wines in front of you that represent these clones, but we've not been successful thus far in getting the funding for that, and there's a good reason for that. With all due respect to AVF, and we can't thank them enough for their support, AVF has a huge, broad range of issues that it deals with, from powdery mildew to vine mealybug to vine physiology to winemaking. They have a host of issues, and their money is limited. And so when it comes down to clones and actually varieties as well, there's a limited amount of ability that they feel they have, the way we're interpreting the response, to do a lot of clonal work. Clones really aren't the same kind of problem that vine mealybug is, and that's understandable. And in concert with that, Foundation, and thanks to Deborah Galino and her crew, is now an efficient, effective, and active importation and release center for clones and varieties. So all that backlog that occurred in the 70s and 80s when we were doing heat treatment is gone now that Deborah and her crew have put the shoot tip culture into place. So now they're spitting these things out regularly, and clones on the order of probably 10 or more a year, and varieties on the order of at least a half a dozen or a dozen a year. And Deborah has created these wonderful relationships with France and Italy and Spain in getting in some of the minor varieties. As of course, she's mentioned, the Ontov group in France has been active in bringing more of those materials in. So we have this difference between lots of things coming through and a lack of available funds to really do much about it. So we're doing what we can. We're going to try to look around this next year or two and see if we can't find other sources beyond AVF, try to stop relying so much on them with this sort of wide portfolio of interest that they have in research, and try to find a place that might be more focused on just doing clones and varieties, and we'll see if we can make that work. Here's the example of that. In fact, this number is wrong. Just by looking at the materials in your packet, and I'm dated from looking back last year at Deborah's release, or her grape list from last fall. Really, there's about 15 Cabernets that don't have any data that I'm aware of, about 12 Cabernet Francs, about 15 Merlots. The number's wrong here for Malbec because I didn't include 2 that are called Cote. So there's 5 Malbecs, 3 Petit Verdot's, and 2 Carmeneres, over which I think there's really right now no data. And so we've got a big job ahead of us, and I think it's important that we get at least some basic information about berry weight, cluster weight, that sort of thing, and hopefully we can. I want to spend a couple minutes, and that's about all, just to ask and answer a couple of questions. I've given this talk in some form over the last decade, and I said a lot of things which turns out weren't entirely true. And it's that old adage about science, is that all you got to do to have something be untrue is do one more experiment. And when you do, sometimes you find out that, well, it doesn't hold all the time. So I want to make that point here by asking a series of questions. Do lower yielding clones show increased pruning weight? I said before they do, and this is the data that I use. We'll just confine ourselves to this top graph in which we have yield on the axis and pruning weight. And if you look, this is Howell Mountain data thanks to Drew Johnson, Foster's, some data that we took out of Lodi with the L and Oakville with the O, and this is now yield per vine. So what we're really reflecting here in these differences in yield from one site to another is really the vine spacing as opposed to actual yield per acre, although I'm sure that's true for some degree to the Howell Mountain stuff. But one of the things that you can see is it looks like when 6 yields less than 8, there's a slight bump in pruning weight. Between 8 and 6, between 8 and 6, it seems pretty consistent. So we said, okay, what we're seeing is that a lower crop load on the vine gives the vine more capacity to grow as a result of that. Here again, we were looking at Merlots before, and we said, boy, we always see that clonate Merlot has the lowest yield pruning weight ratio. And again, if you graph that out here with this being the plot mean for pruning weight, this being the plot mean for yield, here's 8. Pruning weight is higher when the yield is lower, and the rest of these are grouped up in this upper left quadrant. So again, we said, okay, well that again fits the idea that when you have a lower yielding clone, you'll sometimes get a response of the vine, a compensation. We thought we were really smart here too. Here's Malbec that fits that same graph between yield, now a tremendous yield difference between these lower yielding clones in the lower set years versus high yielding clones in good set years. And again, we see a pretty tight relationship between yield and pruning weight. And now, Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir for sparkling wine. These are some selections that have never, to this point, until we wrote this paper, had they ever been reported on in California. These are ones brought in by Gloria Ferrer through the Canada program and then on into Deborah's program. And what we can see here, we had a 0.88 R-square last time. Now we got 0.19. And all you got to do is compare something like 521 and 780 here, where the pruning weight is double at exactly the same yield. So not for Pinot Noir does this situation hold. So either it's just the Bordeaux varieties or it's just the Bordeaux varieties that we had looked at so far. So we would have a little caveat when we answer our question is do lower yielding clones show increased pruning weight? Sometimes, but not always. So be prepared for that. If you decide to go with 6 Cabernet or perhaps 31 for you to think about how you might control growth if you do get that growth response. We see it also, by the way, in Pinot Noir 13, low yielding selection that does seem like it wants to grow a lot, but it's not always true. Is the yield component berries per cluster the driver of yield? I just showed you the Cabernet data, which seems to suggest that it's driven largely by berries per cluster, which drives cluster weight, which drives yield. So we thought, again, we have that pretty much back to our Merlot clone, same plot that I showed you a different kind of expression to the data before. But if you look at yield and see that the yield line going up as berries per cluster goes up, and that we see that although we have a low yielding FPS 8 down here with the triangles, occasionally it'll be up a little bit higher for other clones, but we do see that relationship being pretty tight. Actually 0.93, it's pretty good. 0.97 even, and when we look at back to the Malbec clones, with berries per cluster being the primary driver, and it didn't matter whether it was on 110 or 5C rootstock. Either rootstock, it looked like that was the case. So again, we started talking about this and saying it looks like that's the case. Here's our Pinot Noir friends again, and that graph is 0.28, where berries per cluster is really not the major driver of yield, and all you have to do, again, would be to start picking examples here to compare one direction or the other, and you'll see that it breaks down pretty fast. If you don't know how to interpret the R squared, you can just look at the scatter and see that it's really not a very tight relationship at all. So again, Pinot Noir could just be that we see more variability over time with people who've done a lot of selection. They've actually found things that vary quite a bit more. So the answer to that question is, yes, it's true that berries per cluster can be the driver of yield, but it does not seem to be very tight for Pinot. Is yield correlated with delayed harvest date? In fact, I was interested to note in Larry Hyde's selection that he gifted to Foundation that it's called an early ripening selection, if I read that right. We were asking that question when we got this kind of data out of our original Pinot Noir trial. That one I was showing you data from was the second Pinot Noir that we did for sparkling. But we're looking at bricks versus yield, or we can look at it at days after harvest of the first selection. And what it appears to be is that these are simply yield-related delay in bricks accumulation. And again, that's what it looked like. We get some stars here on our R squared. And then we see one here. This is a Chardonnay for sparkling wine trial that we did. And we didn't even try to fit a line through this thing. The data are so line-like, I guess you can call it. There's 4 way up here, which just is totally almost off the map, and 72, which was quite a bit different. And the rest of these, I suppose we could have fit a line to this, but it didn't seem like it made much sense. So again, if you compare yield, relatively same yields of 96 and 352, or anything with 4, we do not think that in this case that days after harvest or bricks level is related directly to yield. And here's our friend again, the Pinot Noir. And again, you can see that days after harvest is between 5 and 15 days for things that have exactly the same yield. There's 780 and 521. So again, we go back to answer the question, is yield correlated with delayed harvest date? Again, sometimes, but not always. And maybe what we're looking at is just, again, a Pinot Noir effect and not true for other varieties, but other clones of other varieties. But as we'll continue to do more work, I think we will hone in on whether this is, in fact, with all the Cabernets that Deborah now has in the collection, to be a nice chance to start back over and see if that's the case. So the conclusions for clones is that yield is driven primarily by berries per cluster, but again, not always, not entirely. We have seen cases where low-yielding clones appear to compensate with higher growth, and that higher yield can lead to delayed maturation. And again, we've kind of pruned these and let them alone. We didn't do any cluster adjustments or thinning in them at all. Right here.
Jim, I just wanted to say that everyone always likes to hop on a new thing, but as far as global evaluation, it's so important to find out who the regional all-stars are to plant the good material. And so this work you're doing is really important.
Well, thank you for saying that. It's interesting that we did an international symposium on clonal evaluation. I think it was 95 in Portland, and we brought people in from France and Italy, from Australia, all over the place. And it was interesting that out of that, rather than a renewed excitement about clonal evaluation, I think the conclusion from the group was clonal evaluation is very local, and therefore, why do we want to look at one trial when really it's not going to be translatable? I mean, Michael Salachi's experience with things changing as you move the clone around, does beg the question of whether we can really get an answer from this or not. And also, the other interesting thing was when we did a trial in these sparkling wine trials, the very first one we did a tasting. We made wines. In that case, we did have funding to make wines, and we did a tasting. And 2 people walked out of the room. One of them saying, "This is the clone for me," and one of them saying, "I wouldn't plant this clone if I had a gun to my head," and it was the same clone. And so what you end up with is situations where clonal work begins to be a lot about style. And so I think that where ideally where we would go, and this is a group I'm sure has a number of winemakers in it. No matter how we describe the wines when we make them, someone's going to want to taste them. So then that's going to be their gauge as to see whether it has value for their particular wine style or not. So I think ultimately in an ideal program, in a I was going to say Cadillac program, I should probably say a Lexus program, but that aside for the second. That would be where we would have wines and that we would taste them on a regular basis with people. That they would be well-made, small lot wines, and then people could walk away and saying, these are the clones that I'm interested in and not those. And I think if we can get there, I think we'll make some major headways. And I think that's going to be an important component to any future success that we get, that we aspire to. It's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, sorry, but how are we doing?
Any other questions? No, it's fine.
Okay. No other hands? Okay, I think we're good. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.